Are we live? Estamos ao vivo? Let me see. I don't think. Tá aparecendo para você, Mari? Que a gente tá... Ah, agora estamos. Estamos ao vivo. Bom dia, gente. Obrigada a todo mundo que está aqui vendo o nosso evento, o Morrison 90. É uma pequena tentativa de comemorar o aniversário dessa grande escritora que, né, fez tanto para os leitores e tanto para o mundo. E eu queria fazer uns disclaimers agora de ordem prática, que se você está aqui por causa do certificado, um dos seus motivos é por causa do certificado, a gente vai colocar o formulário que você tem que preencher, e depois que você preencher esse formulário, manda um e-mail para o Lero dizendo que você pede o certificado, tá bom? Você tem que fazer isso para todas as mesas de hoje, amanhã e quinta-feira, se você quiser ganhar o certificado de 100% de presença. Então, é isso. Eu vou colocar o link no chat e qualquer pergunta é só fazer no chat do YouTube que a gente responde. Fiquem livres para fazer qualquer tipo de pergunta ao longo das apresentações e aproveitem, ok? Muito obrigada, gente. Eu vou passar a palavra para a professora Sandra Vasconcelos, que ela vai apresentar as nossas convidadas. Sandra, pode falar.
Bom dia a todos, muito obrigada pela presença. É um prazer receber aqui as professoras Justine Talley e Isabel Caldeira, a quem eu já agradeço de antemão por terem aceitado o nosso convite. Espero que nós tenhamos uma bela discussão nos próximos dias a respeito da obra da Toni Morrison, que, penso eu, não só dispensa apresentações, como cujas, vamos dizer assim, contribuições para o universo do romance, para a discussão de gênero, de racismo, foi uma voz importantíssima, né, na literatura. Hoje nós comemoramos, então, os 90 anos de nascimento dessa escritora, dessa grande escritora, que infelizmente já nos deixou. Então, apresento primeiro a professora Justine Talley, and I'm going to turn into English now. Okay, yes, to make life easier for you, Justine. I don't know if you could understand my initial words, but anyway, so sort of, that's fine. So I'm turning into English now. So Professor Justine Talley is a retired professor of American literature at the University of Laguna, where she has specialized in African American literature and culture. She is the author of Paradise Reconsidered, Toni Morrison, Stories, Histories, and Truths, 1999, The Story of Jazz, Toni Morrison's Dialogic Imagination, 2001, and Toni Morrison's Beloved, Origins, 2009. And she has also edited the Cambridge Companion to Toni Morrison, 2007, and co-edited with Shirley A. Stave, Toni Morrison's Mercy, Critical Approaches, 2011. So it's a pleasure to have you with us, Justine, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for switching into English because my Spanish helps with Portuguese, but I apologize, I'm not fluent. First of all, I would thank you all for being here in this special morning, and special thanks to Mariana and Beatriz and all the team for organizing a special seminar on Toni Morrison. Especially, I want to extend my appreciation for the invitation to speak about my latest research in Toni Morrison. Now, of all the things that we could think of to analyze the author's work, history is certainly one of the most potent. Every single one of her novels, or 11 novels, the 12th one is still pending, but every single one centers on a different historical era of the United States and the position of Black people within it. In the case of Home, her 10th novel, Morrison focuses on the 1950s. This is what she called my time, a time she felt in which so many problems had been glossed over. The Korean police episode, which was never even designated a war, the McCarthy-led hearings by the House on Un-American Activities, and the violent segregation laws of the Jim Crow era that kept African Americans in their place and far distant from enjoying the wealth and glossy post-war decade of well-off middle-class citizens, like the ones we would see on TV in characters like Doris Day or in the series Leave It to Beaver. She said she wanted to rip the scab off and discover the wounds festering underneath. Yet, while Morrison may be writing about the past, she is always very much speaking to the present, and I'll talk more about that in just a moment. From the very first page, in which we have a longish poem from Honey and Rue, they're actually lyrics of a song that she wrote for a musical, it ends by saying, "Why does its lock fit my key?" And of course, as you will certainly have noticed, early in the narrative, a minor character is actually named John Locke, the Reverend of the Zion Methodist Church, who takes Frank in and helps him on his way. Now, this call is clear. The question is, why? On the one hand, many Americans looked upon John Locke as a crucial philosopher for the United States, still celebrated for his importance to the Founding Fathers and to the writing of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. And the calls to the Constitution and the Founding Fathers are strident in these divisive days. However, on the one hand, Locke's views on African slavery were problematic, and on the other, those theories for which he is celebrated in the American traditions were highly compromised when examined from a Black point of view, which is laid out explicitly in the novel Home. So in keeping with Morrison's presentist stance, it's important to note that Home was published in the spring of 2012, just at the end of what was called the Arab Spring, and that certain Arab scholars, even earlier, were calling to Locke's theories as grounds for new government in their own country. But the reference to John Locke and the Arab world is much more than a cursory nod to the philosopher. In fact, Locke was apparently deeply indebted to the medieval philosophers in the Maghreb and the southern Mediterranean, thus producing an overt paradox. Many Americans today are vociferously condemning Muslims while celebrating their founding fathers, the Constitution, and the influence of John Locke. Yet, Locke himself lifted many of his philosophical points directly from the Arabs. The point of this present research is to examine, on the one hand, how Locke's philosophical theories are interpreted from a Black point of view in the narrative, and on the other, how these same theories were historically set out by Arab philosophers centuries before him. I propose to touch on the following points: the ethics of the self, knowledge and human understanding, property, labor, and the introduction of money, religion and toleration, contrition, penitence, and atonement, and the conclusion, the definition of manhood and returning to the ethics of the self. Now, you may all know that John Locke studied at Oxford. We're in the latter part of the 17th century. And he majored in things like Latin, Greek, Dutch, and Arabic, and Islamic studies. There he coincided with Edward Pocock and Henry Stubb and knew their work, including their translations from the Arabic. At one point, John Locke was exiled from Great Britain for his supposed involvement in the uprising against the government. When he was exiled, he spent a year in France and then 6 years in the Dutch republics, and moved in the circles of the disciples of Baruch Spinoza during the period when translations from Arabic text were prevalent and trade with the Levant was flourishing. There's every reason to believe that Locke would have been familiar with Arabic philosophical texts. With all this in mind, I would like to set out these influences and repercussions on Locke and how these are manifest in the novel. Understanding the theories of John Locke and his indebtedness to the philosophies of major Arab scholars becomes central to unlocking the narrative of Home. In Home, the theories of Locke are very much examined through the discrepancy of the founding myth and the actual way they played out in Black life in the United States. That Morrison is questioning the myths of the founding of the United States is underscored by her droll and at times acerbic comments on the fairy tales that we children have grown up with. For example, of the farmer who killed the goose that laid the golden eggs out of his own avarice, Miss Ethel scoffs. Remember that story about the goose and the golden eggs, how the farmer took the eggs and how greed made him stupid enough to kill the goose? I always thought a dead goose could have made at least one good meal. But gold? Shoot! That was always the only thing on Lenore's mind. She had it, loved it, and thought it put it above everybody else. Just like the farmer. Why didn't he plow his land, seed it, and grow something to eat? Another important aspect of John Locke's theories concerns the ethics of the self and what it means to be what it means to be a man is very evident from the very beginning of Home. In the opening poem, from the lyrics for Honey and Rue again, the metaphor of the house is more than a reference to the homelessness of Black people in the United States during and after slavery, and the longing for a place to call home. It also serves as a metaphor for the self, empty of purpose and understanding, and the protagonist's confusion about what it means to be a man. So the Locke which fits his key and his dreams of a better life will pose the questions that Frank Money contemplates in his struggle to define his own manhood. Indeed, Morrison herself stated that what she wanted to explore in the novel is the meaning of manhood when applied to a Black man, quote, whose virility and whose manhood and adulthood is constantly threatened or belittled, and he has to, quote, prove himself. What kind of selfhood is it possible to possess when we come from a spiritually impoverished home, one that fails to concede, let alone nourish, each inhabitant's worth? It's important to notice in the poem as well that the shadows lie, a signal that Frank is far from being honest throughout most of the novel until he finds a greater reason for his life. His fascination with the horses, which is the other major metaphor at the beginning of the novel, that, quote, stood like men, he alleges, erases the horrific memory of the live burial by white men of a Black man. There are moments a child cannot deal with and must suppress. Later in the novel, Frank asks a young boy, Thomas, whose arm has been destroyed by a police shooting, what he wants to be when he grows up. The child answers simply, a man. Exactly what Frank finds so elusive. So what Morrison wanted this character to do was to learn another way to be an adult, to be a man. Growing up, Frank finds purpose in his protection of his sister, C. Who am I without her? That underfed girl with the sad, waiting eyes. Inadvertently postponing any sense of self she might have developed on her own. Later, Frank and his homeboys leave the stifling suffocation of their own town, Lotus, to find meaning and adventure in the army, fighting in Korea. Losing both friends, Stuff and Red, in the fighting, Frank is cut loose from any definition of himself. It takes him a long journey back to recovery to be able to admit that the indiscriminate killing, which he justified as revenge for the loss of his buddies, was actually an attempt to murder that lowlife in himself. Now, with Mike gone, he was brave, whatever that meant. There were not enough dead gooks or chinks in the world to satisfy him. The copper smell of blood no longer sickened him. It gave him appetite. Losing his homeboys has left him bereft. But I know them. I know them and they know me. Who is he now that his buddies that know him are gone? Behind his obsession with the loss of his buddies lies an even greater struggle with the loss of himself. The violent loss of his friends turns him into an unfeeling killing machine, exacerbated by the sexual abuse and subsequent murder of a young Korean girl. What type of a man is that? What does that say about his manhood? On his return to the west coast of the US, a severe case of what is now called PTSD leaves him unable to function, keep a job, or control his actions, desperately fleeing from the memories he is unable to deal with, ultimately exhausting the one woman in his life with whom he has found love. So the message summoning home to Georgia to rescue his beloved C sets him on a journey to search for himself as well as for his sister. In his essay on human understanding, Locke defines three types of knowledge: intuitive, demonstrative, and sensitive. The first, intuitive, is how we know we exist, ourselves. The second, demonstrative, is how we know God exists. And the third is how we acquire knowledge through experience, through our senses. The first two, however, had already been addressed by Ibn Sina, also known in the Western world as Avicenna, who, according to Peter Adamson, was the greatest philosopher of the Arabic world. To illustrate the intuitive, Ibn Sina's thought experiment concerns, quote, the floating man, in which a person cut off from all sensual stimuli would nevertheless be aware of his own existence. The existence of God is illustrated in Ibn Sina in his Proof of the Truthful, in which he argued there must be a necessary existence, an entity that cannot not exist, which he identified with the Islamic conception of God. Ibn Hazm, and I apologize for the pronunciation of the Arabic names, I never studied Arabic, so I don't know. Ibn Hazm wrote The Scope of Logic, in which he stressed the importance of sense perception as a source of knowledge, which is also echoed in the work of Ibn Tufayl. One of Locke's most celebrated ideas is that far from being born with any innate ideas, Children are born as blank slates, that is, tabula rasa, upon which life experience will inscribe meaning. But the idea of the tabula rasa is proposed much earlier in a 12th century novel by Ibn Tufayl entitled Hai Ibn Yaksan, in which a young child grows alone in understanding his life through his experiences. In Home, Morrison sets Frank up alone, like Ibn Yaksan, with no guidance, no innate novel of self. Although Frank does have family, his parents are always working in the fields as hands there, and then they both die young, his mother of asthma and his father of a stroke. His step-grandmother, Lenore, holds the children in contempt. Therefore, there is no one to nurture him, no one to teach him anything. Frank is literally reduced to a blank sheet with no identity and no sense of self, and must learn from his experience. Having lost his friends in the war, he's also lost his self-definition. When, on receiving the note about the threat to his beloved sister, he leaves Lily, she gathers up his army dog tags, that is his military identification, and puts them away in the drawer. He's literally left without identity. His loss of awareness winds him up, possibly, in a psychiatric ward, unable to remember anything about what happened to land him there. Later, Reverend Locke will make a comment about the hospital using inmates for their organs to sell to other hospitals. That is, Frank's self is reduced to the usefulness of his individual body parts. The only thing he knows at this point is that he must lie extremely still so that the orderlies will not give him more morphine to keep him drugged, much as he lay dead on the battlefield so that the North Koreans would not try to finish the job. Frank goes through a mental exercise of thinking about what he can concentrate on in order not to move. This is an exercise in what Locke called associationism. The trick of imitating semicoma, like playing dead face down on a muddy battlefield, was to concentrate on a single neutral object, something that would smother any random hint of life. Ice, he thought, a cube of it, an icicle, an ice-crusted pond, or a frozen landscape. No, too much emotion attached to frozen hills. Fire, then? Never, too active. He would need something that stirred no feelings, encouraged no memory, sweet nor shameful. Just searching for an item was agitation. Everything reminded him of something loaded with pain. He will eventually come up with the idea of train tracks, endless, endless train tracks. Frank then is stripped of any identity or orientation and sets off in the snow to begin his journey toward self-knowledge. Locke's third and possibly more important way to acquire self-knowledge is the sensitive. Knowledge is obtained through the 5 senses, which allow anyone to experience the world around us. In Book 2, Chapter 1 of his essay, he affirms that, quote, all ideas come from sensation or reflection. All the materials of reason and knowledge come from experience. The objects of sensation is one source of ideas, as our senses are responsible for the distinct perception of things. The escape from the hospital ward, barefoot, strips Frank down to the bare essentials and marks the beginning of his journey towards knowledge through his senses. Haptic, Frank loosens the canvas cups, unshackles himself, rips off the hospital gown, the cold of the latter so painful he jumps into the snow. Auditory, no noises except for the weeping from the room next to the fire exit. No squeak of an orderly's shoes or smothered giggles. And the hinges groaned when he opened the door. Visual, maniac moonlight doing the work of absent stars matched his desperate frenzy, lighting his hunched shoulders and footprints left in the snow. Olfactory, no smell of cigarette smoke. Gustatory, once at Locke's house, Jean, his wife, brings him salt water and soda crackers and then provides a breakfast of oatmeal and over-buttered toast. There's no doubt in the question of very few paragraphs that Morrison is definitely setting out perception through each of the five senses. As Frank travels, his senses continue to play an important role in his perception. It is noteworthy at the beginning of his journey, he suffers bouts of color blindness. For long stretches, he perceives everything in his passing landscape in black and white, fervently hoping that these stretches are only one more effect of his PTSD. Through the kindness of the strangers who help him along his way, Frank slowly re-enters the place he had thought he only wanted to leave far, far behind. As he does so, having saved C from certain death at the hands of a white doctor, the colors of Lotus, Georgia spring to life so vividly that he wonders if they had always been so intense and so clear. Another major aspect of John Locke's theory is his concern with property, labor, and the introduction of money. Frank and C's last name, money, calls to his theory of the acquisition of property. And remember that John Locke talked about life, liberty, and the pursuit of property, not of happiness. In the early stages of settlement in the new colony, indentured servants were promised certain land upon the finalization of their indenture. But it soon became clear that land was a finite commodity. The pursuit of property as a fundamental right in the Declaration of Independence would mean too much competition for the established landowners. In Locke's theory, property was directly linked to the labor put into its acquisition, thus originally defining the value of property as labor-based. The proper concern of government, Locke argued in a letter concerning toleration, is the protection of life, liberty, health, and property. Yet, 300 years before, even Khaldun in the Muqaddimah had already written that the concomitants of good rulership are kindness to and protection of one's subjects. Those who infringe upon property commit an injustice. Those who deny people their rights commit an injustice. Arab philosophers affirmed that the state had to guarantee the right to property as well as to life and liberty. This was clear in Islamic law and well accepted throughout Muslim empires. Of course, all of this is meaningless in the Black world of home in the 1950s. Lily has saved up enough money, fruit of her own personal efforts, to afford a nice house in the suburbs of the northwest city of Seattle, not even the south. But she's blocked because of the neighborhood stipulation in the contracts as explained by the agent in the real estate office. Quote, "No part of said property hereby conveyed shall ever be used or occupied by any Hebrew or by any person of the Ethiopian, Malay, or Asiatic race, excepting only employees in domestic service," end quote. Lily is offered real estate in other neighborhoods, but she proudly declines. In Lotus, of course, things are worse, and there's even less opportunity. the single most reason that Frank and his buddies had signed up for the Army. Quote, in Lotus, Georgia, there was nothing to do but mindless work in fields you didn't own, couldn't own, and wouldn't own if you had any other choice. But Locke had stipulated that through a man's labor he could acquire only as much as he himself could use personally. Excess should be given to others, and charity was necessary to alleviate want and poverty among people who could not provide for themselves. This generosity characterizes the women of Lotus. There was no excess in their gardens because they shared everything. There was no trash or garbage in their homes because they had a use for everything. They took responsibility for their lives and for whoever else needed them. This charity is also demonstrated in several characters Frank encounters on his journey home. First, Reverend John Locke and his wife Anne, who give him socks, ripped galoshes, and as much money as they have out of the poor box, enough to get him to the next pastor, who more or less begrudgingly gives him a coat and enough for a train ticket to Chicago. Although supplied with addresses from Green's Traveler's Book for places that will accept Negroes, the porter on the train instructs him to go to Booker's, where he can get a good meal inexpensively and enjoy good company and a homey atmosphere. There, a man, Billy, takes him under his wing and invites him home to his house to sleep for the night. The next morning, Billy takes him to buy decent clothes and shoes at the Goodwill store, and a wallet off a street vendor, before seeing him off on the train south. There are two more instances of unsolicited charity. First, the Good Samaritan, who is probably a white man because it specifically mentions he has a long ponytail that, quote, catches the light of a street lamp. We're in the 50s, remember. Who succors him on the streets in Atlanta after Frank has been beaten up and robbed by young thugs, and who gives him money for the gypsy cab to get to sea. And secondly, again, the women of the community of Lotus, who share what they have and provide for those who cannot provide for themselves, including Lenore, incapacitated by stroke, even though they know she continues to look down on them. As in Locke's view, everyone is entitled to be taken care of in their old age and infirmity. It was a testimony to the goodwill of church-going and God-fearing neighboring women that they brought her plates of food, swept the floors, washed her linen, would have bathed her too, except for her pride and their sensitivity that forbade it. They knew that the woman they were helping despised them all, so they didn't even have to say out loud what they understood to be true, that the Lord works in mysterious ways his wonders to perform. What compromised Locke's theory of labor, of course, was the introduction of money, which allowed for the accumulation of goods and property beyond that which one could use for one's own personal need. Well, money meant that right and conveniency no longer went together. Locke felt deeply ambivalent. The moral fragility of commercial capitalism had come briefly but sharply into focus. Frank jokingly calls himself smart money, while C money calls to the invisible because she has none. Trying to earn more money is precisely what drives her to work for the speculative, invading doctor who destroys her reproductive system for his own investigations which he hopes will lead to government patents, therefore leading him to more money. After a couple of weeks on the job, C enters Dr. Bow's office to examine the books on his bookshelf, which include The Passing of the Great Race, Heredity, Race and Society, and Out of the Night, which, and I will quote, discusses the progressive objectives of the eugenics movement directed towards social engineering through the use of Mendelian principles and controlled propagation of human offspring. End quote. The obvious irony here, of course, is that Dr. Bow, the doctor and scientist, himself has two encephalitic doctors, and his wife never leaves the house and has a tiny laudanum craving. Karen Bird writes that Locke searched in manuscripts for evidence to support his belief that the diversity located in the human condition corresponded with the diversity evident in the natural world, and that human diversity was an essential feature of the human condition, which supplemented his philosophical discussions on toleration. It also undergirds his critique of human innateness, thereby invalidating apologies for eugenics. Who decides what traits should be transmitted or eliminated? Scientific racism was used as a value judgment employed for notions of racial superiority. This runs contrary to Locke's affirmation that natural laws undergird natural rights, which substantiate his theories on human understanding and toleration. Isaac Newton actually borrowed from Ibn al-Haytham the idea that there are natural laws that run the universe. And from there, Enlightenment philosophers use the idea of natural laws to support the concept of natural rights, the government's role, and economic systems. According to Islamic thought, all humans are born in a natural state of purity, with belief in one God, a social interpretation of the acquisition of religion. Diversity in the natural world corresponded to diversity in human society. Which brings us now to religion and toleration. Frank returns from Korea in great disillusionment, calls for Jesus did not succor his friends dying on the battlefield. Learning of the police wounding Thomas so that he was kept off the streets and in the classroom, Frank comments that the cop did him a favor. His father answers, no. Jesus stepped in and did that. He said, hold on there, Mr. Police Guy. Don't hurt the least of mine. He who harms the least of mine disturbs the tranquility of my mind. Beautiful, thought Frank. Bible stuff works every time, every place, except the fire zone. Yet faith in God permeates the Black community, even though religious affiliation is fluid. Even when the officer of the state will not recognize these poor Black people, reliance on God is pervasive. For the Black community, practicing their faith is more important than any religious affiliation. You couldn't learn age, but adulthood was there for all. Mourning was helpful, but God was better, and they did not want to meet their Maker and have to explain a wasteful life. They knew he would ask each of them one question: what have you done? Some evil, they believed, was incorrigible, so its demise was left best to the Lord. Other kinds could be mitigated. The point was to know the difference. When Frank finally arrives to rescue C, Sarah can breathe more easily. Thank God. Exactly the old way the old folks said. Not when you call him, not when you want him, only when you need him, and right on time. This is actually a very similar point of view to that of Locke. Genuine knowledge of morality turns out to be as much beyond men's own reach as a true science of nature. What replaces it in the real lives of men, as Locke imagined these, is a combination of judgment with trust in divine benevolence. Locke's stance on religious toleration has to do with his focus on the stability of political authority, which was more important to him than any religious beliefs. Locke defended his essay on toleration, in which he argued that civil rights were independent of religious belief and faith was not relevant to citizenship. He always favored political order over freedom of religion. Long before the 17th century, however, the Arab world was recognizing the rights and even citizenship of dissenters from the Muslim faith, prizing their peaceable fealty to the political state over any individual cult. Locke admired the organization of the Arab world in its accommodation to the variety of peoples and faiths that cohabited within its realm. Based on the Arab experience in governing, religion should not be coerced. And while not celebrating himself the Muslim creed or theology, Locke nevertheless recognizes the faith and morality of the Muslim adherents. He recognizes them as people of the book. His letter on toleration is guided by the need to recognize Muslims as citizens within the British realm, without any demand for conversion, which had only led to wars and more strife in Europe. Contrition, penitence, and atonement. After C's harrowing ordeal with Dr. Bowe, what facilitates her healing is the acceptance of her internal damage such that she can never have children, and her reclamation of her right to mourn. It's just as sad as it ought to be, and I'm not going to hide from what's true just because it hurts. First steps in taking responsibility for her own self without relying on her brother or on any other man. The demanding love of Ethel Fordham soothed and strengthened her the most. Somewhere inside you is that free person I'm talking about. Locate her and let her do some good in the world. Frank's admission of his murder of the little Korean girl and later his indiscriminate killing of other fleeing civilians, which he had justified to himself as revenge, is really only a distraction from his self-loathing disguised as somebody else's fault. His ultimate acceptance of personal responsibility for these facts prompts him to make some kind of amends by giving the lynched man he saw interred by whites in his childhood, a proper burial. Wrapping the victim in C's first attempt at a quilt and burying him in the vertical, Frank marks the grave under the split bay tree with a wooden marker. Here stands a man. Wishful thinking, perhaps, but he could have sworn the sweet bay tree was pleased to agree. Its olive green leaves went wild in the glow of a fat cherry red sun. Frank has come back from the war, tormented by the loss of his friends and his own moral failing. The narrative sets out his loss of senses, as we mentioned before, early in the novel. It happened first when he boarded a bus near Fort Lawton, discharge papers intact, just sitting next to a brightly dressed woman. Frank watched the flowers at the hem of her skirt blackening and the red blouse draining of color until it was white as milk. Then everything, all color disappeared, and the world became a black and white movie screen. Frank's journey to manhood brings him full circle to the return of his perception. While C is being assiduously cared for and healed by the women of Lotus, Frank opens up to the quickening of his senses in his environs. Banished from C's bedside by Miss Ethel for his maleness, Frank's senses are bombarded with the luxurious sensuality of his surroundings. The sun did her best to burn away the blessed peace found under the wide old trees, did her best to ruin the pleasure of being among those who did not want to degrade or destroy me. Try as she might, she could not scorch the yellow butterflies away from the scarlet rose bushes, nor choke the songs of birds. This feeling of safety and goodwill, he knew, was exaggerated, but savoring it was real. He convinced himself that nearby pork ribs sizzled on a yard grill, and inside the house there was potato salad and coleslaw, and early sweet peas too, a pound cake cooled on the top of an icebox. In only a few lines from 2 paragraphs, Morrison again touches on every one of the 5 senses: the heat of the sun, the visual beauty of the butterfly and the flowers, the sounds of birds and music, the smell of the sizzling ribs, and the taste of fresh vegetables and even pound cake. Frank may rationally know that he may be overinterpreting his reality, but his senses bring the peace of mind of being at home, and they become the guide to his knowledge of himself. Frank has at last found a way to manhood, just as Morrison proposed in the conception of her story. Although home does not solve the dead-end lives that Black people were confined to in suffocating places like Lotus in the 1950s and beyond, it does redefine the concept of masculinity and what it means for a Black male searching for his place in the world. Not the violence and death of waging war, not the external symbols exemplified in Prince's appropriation of the car, not Lenore's predilection for gold, nor even Lily's dream of earning enough money to buy a house. Frank's manhood is defined in his taking responsibility for his own life and mistakes, and righting a wrong that has haunted him from childhood. Though Frank has questioned the pertinence of God and Jesus to his own experience in the war, he nevertheless comes to express the case for an ethical life as set out by Ibn Hattam in his book, In Pursuit of Virtue. Do not use your energy except for a cause more noble than yourself. Such a cause cannot be found except in Almighty God himself. To preach the truth, to defend womanhood, to repel humiliation which your Creator has not imposed upon you, to help the oppressed. Anyone who uses his energy for the sake of the vanities of the world is like someone who exchanges gemstones for gravel. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Justine, for this beautiful presentation and for also introducing us to such original new material. I had no idea about Locke's, perhaps borrowing from or appropriation of these Arabic philosophical ideas. It's really incredible. Thanks very much. Okay, so I think we will leave the questions or comments for the end, and I'll now pass on to Isabel. And I suppose that let's see if Isabel's ready. I suppose that's it's going to be in Portuguese, right, Isabel? Isabel está sem som.
Já me ouve?
Sim.
Já
agora...
me ouve, Sandra?
Sim.
Eu estava, portanto, eu perguntei à Beatriz, mas ela achou que preferiam em português, portanto vou falar em português.
Claro, claro. Não, porque alguns dos nossos, enfim, algumas das pessoas que estão nos ouvindo, estão assistindo, não têm tanta familiaridade, estão interessadas no tema, mas não têm tanta familiaridade com a língua inglesa, então é bom que a gente faça um pouco meio a meio, né? Então, perfeito. Eu vou, então, apresentar a Isabel. Isabel vai fazer a apresentação dela, vai fazer a palestra dela em português, e antes disso, passo, então, a apresentação da professora Isabel Caldeira, que é professora associada da seção de estudos anglo-americanos do Departamento de Línguas, Literaturas e Culturas da Faculdade de Letras da Universidade de Coimbra. Ela concluiu seu doutorado em 93, na própria Universidade de Coimbra, e a tese tinha como título A Cicatriz da Palavra, História, Mito e Literatura na Ficção de Toni Morrison. Seus interesses de pesquisa incluem temas referentes a estudos americanos e afro-americanos, assim como estudos literários e culturais comparados. Então, é um prazer ter a professora Isabel conosco. Então, passo-lhe a palavra. Muito obrigada.
Muito obrigada a todos e a todas, especialmente pelo convite que me foi endereçado pela Beatriz Ramos, a quem agradeço também toda a prontidão, enfim, todos os esclarecimentos durante este tempo. Agradeço à professora Sandra Vasconcelos e tenho muito prazer em estar aqui. Como lhe disse, também entendi que poderíamos, assim, também atingir um público que não está tão à vontade no inglês, por isso eu escolhi na minha breve apresentação PowerPoint, colocar as citações em inglês. Talvez assim ajude um pouco também a seguir o meu pensamento. I would like to say to Justine that I'm sorry that I'll be speaking in Portuguese, but that was the interest of our hosts at the University of São Paulo, and so unfortunately we cannot communicate so well, but I was really impressed by your presentation, so knowledgeable and illuminating. Então eu vou dar início, vou falar hoje sobre Nação e Cidadania na obra de Toni Morrison, que foi uma autora que nunca me abandonou ou não abandonei desde a minha tese de doutoramento. Um ano depois, ou poucos meses depois de ela ter ganho o Prémio Nobel. Num desafio lançado pela New Yorker em novembro de 2016, a 16 escritores para que reagissem à recente eleição de Donald Trump como 45º presidente da nação, anunciava-se uma era em que os direitos civis de muitos grupos subalternos, incluindo mulheres, ficariam sob ataque e os imigrantes especialmente debaixo de fogo. Nessa secção da New Yorker, George Packer, jornalista e escritor premiado, já previa o que veio realmente a acontecer. Na sua análise, Packer diagnosticava lucidamente os sinais de fragilização da sociedade americana que permitiram que Trump se instalasse no poder. Em destaque, o enfraquecimento das instituições democráticas desde os anos 70, a crise da imprensa tradicional e a desagregação da opinião pública. Paro aqui só para perguntar se me ouvem bem. Eu sei que tenho tido muitos alunos e alunas brasileiros que no início, quando chegam à Universidade de Coimbra, têm dificuldade em entender-nos bem, porque nós sabemos como os portugueses engolem sílabas, por isso eu espero que me estejam bem a seguir bem. Toni Morrison contribuiu para esse fórum da New Yorker com o texto Mourning for Whiteness, em luto em relação à branquitude, em que defende que nos Estados Unidos, mais do que em qualquer país europeu, a branquitude sempre serviu de força unificadora. A definição de americanidade, para muitos, tem a ver com a cor da pele. Morrison ecoa James Baldwin, num texto que ele intitulou On Being White and Other Lies, que foi inicialmente publicado em 84 e incluído em 85 na coletânea The Price of the Ticket. Tanto Baldwin como Morrison acentuam a exclusividade de se ser considerado americano, associada a ser ou tornar-se branco. E Morrison percebe na sociedade contemporânea dos Estados Unidos um movimento de reposição de uma branquitude que se sente ameaçada. Ameaçada fundamentalmente pelo outro, predominantemente um outro marcado pela sua pigmentação, aquele ou aquela a quem está vedado escolher tornar-se branco, branca. Num texto apresentado na Universidade de Cornell em 1998, reproduzido na antologia de 2019 Mouth Full of Blood, estranhamente esta antologia foi publicada nos Estados Unidos no mesmo ano com outro título, The Source of Self-Regard. Esse texto, incluído nesta coletânea, Literature and Public Life, portanto, literatura e vida pública, Neil Morrison, tal como Packer, já lamenta que hoje em dia estejamos cada vez mais alheados da coisa pública, cada vez mais autocentrados, alienados da vida em comunidade. No contexto dessa intervenção, Morrison refere o empobrecimento da nossa participação como cidadãos e cidadãs no espaço público, submetidas e anestesiadas que estamos por um mercado de consumo e de espetáculo, afastadas que somos da verdade e dos valores pela constante exposição ao falseamento e distorção das notícias e dos comentários nas redes sociais. Efetivamente, em várias outras ocasiões, Morrison comentou e lastimou que tivéssemos deixado de ser cidadãos e cidadãs para passarmos a ser primeiro consumidores e depois contribuintes. No geral, definimos cidadania, e aqui para, no fundo, entendermos bem onde é que nos situamos dentro deste conceito, no geral definimos-la como uma condição de membro de uma comunidade política, o que implica deveres e direitos. Mas também podemos acrescentar que esse estatuto implica a capacidade de agir, ter agência. Num Estado-nação em que certos grupos e indivíduos são excluídos da cidadania plena, verifica-se um desequilíbrio dramático entre os direitos e os deveres e falhas da representação política que reduzem a tal agência. Então, agir passa a significar resistir. Focando especificamente no contexto dos Estados Unidos, a filósofa Iris Young defende que o conceito liberal americano de cidadania igualitária não corresponde à noção de cidadania universal, que implica um coletivo homogéneo, sem considerações de diferença, o que aliás é sempre algo mítico. E ainda mais importante é pensar que a cidadania universal concebe igualdade, mas entre iguais. Ora, dada a textura da história e da ideologia americana, a assimilação raramente respeita as diferenças. Contudo, para Morrison, o verdadeiro sentido de cidadania, ou não digo verdadeiro, mas o mais profundo sentido de cidadania, excede os próprios direitos civis. Tem a ver com uma existência partilhada em comunidade, com responsabilidade em relação aos outros, com preocupação com o bem-estar dos nossos vizinhos, dos nossos velhos, das nossas crianças. E agora pedi à Beatriz o primeiro slide. The happily adult responsibility of being citizens to each other. Como ela diz. Para ela, e define, a citizen thinks primarily about his or her community and is preoccupied with the safety of the neighborhood, the health of the elderly and disabled, the well-being of the young. A taxpayer thinks mostly about himself or herself, about who or what is taxing, that is to say, taking his hard-earned money to give to some undeserving body or some other distant, wasteful thing. Portanto, ela aqui, nesta citação, está exatamente a valorizar aquilo que para ela é profundamente a cidadania e como isso se distingue do tal pagador de impostos ou consumidor. Esta concepção e esta preocupação com a cidadania perpassa a obra de Toni Morrison, quer da pensadora, que realmente foi, sempre atenta ao mundo em seu redor, com uma perspectiva agudamente crítica, quer na sua ficção. Tendo em vista a sua profusa intervenção pública, poderíamos até considerar a sua obra como um serviço público, tal como concebe Odile Anders no seu livro de 2015, Writers as Public Intellectuals. Ou, nos termos em que eu tenho vindo a defender, nos trabalhos que tenho vindo a publicar, um amplo ato de cidadania que a converte numa escritora cidadã, a writer as citizen. No caso da sua ficção, falo também de cidadania, já que a escritora se funda profundamente na história, abordando vários momentos da experiência afro-americana, com elevado sentido crítico e político, expondo o ataque aos direitos civis constantemente perpetrado na sociedade dos Estados Unidos, desde a sua fundação como nação, e valorizando, no fundo, esses sentidos de comunidade e de respeito. De facto, os afro-americanos foram, ao lado dos povos americanos nativos, excluídos da cidadania quando da fundação da nação. Ainda que as emendas à Constituição, feitas depois da Guerra Civil, tenham prometido esses direitos de cidadania, o certo é que eles foram postos em causa nas décadas posteriores devido à discriminação racista, à segregação racial. Pedindo emprestada a expressão a David Ang e Shin Han, Salamisha Tillet argumenta que os afro-americanos ainda se encontram num estado de assimilação suspensa. Ela fala de suspended assimilation, que os mantém continuamente afastados de uma cidadania americana que preservou do passado o seu objetivo primordial, o ideal da branquitude. Como observa R. Berlin em The Long Emancipation, The Demise of Slavery in the United States, 2015, os brancos podiam encarar ou até defender a hipótese da liberdade para os negros, mas tinham muito mais dificuldade em aceitar a igualdade que estava implicada na cidadania. Por isso, os direitos civis, inscritos na Constituição depois da Guerra Civil, foram torpedeados durante um século e mesmo depois de repostos, não conferiram aos afro-americanos senão uma cidadania de segunda. Talvez por isso, a cidadania plena, que nunca foi apanágio dos afro-americanos, se cifra na ficção de Toni Morrison como a combinação da liberdade, comunidade, dignidade e agência, ingredientes fundamentais da cidadania, já que a verdadeira igualdade parece inalcançável. Contra essa supremacia branca, exclusão, racismo, em prol da liberdade, cidadania e dignidade humana. Em toda a obra de Morrison se percebe um profundo sentido de empatia e responsabilidade em relação aos outros. Morrison expressou muito eloquentemente em Playing in the Dark, quando falou de responsibility. Ao desconstruir a palavra, joga com o sentido de responsabilidade, com o sentido de responder por algo, prestar contas ao outro, mas traz para primeiro plano essa capacidade de adesão ao outro, de empatia. Relaciona este posicionamento de Morrison com o de Gayatri Spivak, num ensaio intitulado Responsibility. Spivak foca-se especificamente sobre as responsabilidades intelectuais e desdobra os sentidos de responsabilidade no inglês. The ethical responsibility, accountability, answerability. No fundo, sublinha o sentido ético de cada um ou uma responder por seus atos em relação ao outro, subalterno. Para isso, Spivak define responsabilidade como o ato levado a cabo como uma resposta a um dever. Este tipo de resposta envolve responder a, mas em certas situações significa responder por. Por trás do pensamento de Spivak, muito possivelmente de Morrison, está a distinção que Derrida faz entre répondre à e répondre de. Novamente, este responder a, responder por. E também está em diálogo com Emmanuel Levinas e a sua concepção do outro, que o eu nunca consegue apreender completa e perfeitamente. De facto, na obra de Morrison, percebemos sempre uma preocupação ética em relação ao outro, no seu caso específico, um sujeito racializado, discriminado pelo racismo, injustiçado. A escritora sempre afirmou inequivocamente que escreve para os negros, Ela própria sempre se posicionou claramente como mulher negra, mulher racializada, que não tem nada que explicar o que quer dizer. E não, como muitos outros escritores afro-americanos, olhar por cima do ombro para os brancos. Morrison sempre privilegiou um público leitor negro, o que ecoa para mim na tal ideia de constituição de um espaço comunitário exclusivo através da linguagem, tal como também é proposto por Bell Hooks. Declara Morrison, I'm interested in black readers and me. Novamente se percebe, e agora eu pedi outra vez à Beatriz um novo slide, novamente se percebe um sentido comunitário numa experiência partilhada que não tem que ser explicada para fora da comunidade. E eu cito-a, There are certain things I don't want to expose, not because whites shouldn't know, but they are not who I am addressing the book to. The black people who never pick up a book, the black people in my books who don't read books, are the people who authenticate that book for me. A referência à autenticação não é gratuita, como sabemos. Traz consigo a associação à necessidade vivida pelos ex-escravizados ou foragidos, autores de narrativas autobiográficas, as chamadas narrativas de escravos, que serviam à causa abolicionista. Esses textos tinham sempre que ser autenticados por abolicionistas ou outros brancos respeitáveis da comunidade, chamados a atestar quer a verdade das experiências narradas, quer a autoria, já que esta não condizia com as expectativas de um público que crescera na convicção da inferioridade intelectual dos negros. Agora, Morrison apropria-se desse processo de autenticação, roubando-o aos brancos, devolvendo-o aos negros. Toda a obra de Morrison é, de facto, uma reflexão sobre o racismo como ideologia, cuja lógica se propôs metodicamente desmantelar, para provar que a raça verdadeiramente não importa. Race does not matter. No entanto, serve como fundamento para excluir. Então, é necessário que nos interpelemos, como ela nos interpela, constantemente, sobre afinal para que importa a raça, já que somos todos simplesmente raça humana. E eu cito-a, What is race? Other than genetic imagination? Why does it matter? Once its parameters are known, defined, if at all possible, what behavior does it demand, encourage? Race is the classification of species, and we are the human race, period. Then what is this other thing? The hostility, the social racism, the othering. E é aqui que nos temos que fixar. E ela se fixa também, para nos interpelarmos. Porquê essa hostilidade? Porquê o racismo? Porquê a alteridade? Por isso, Toni Morrison acompanhada por uma longa produção teórica de historiadores, sociólogos, outros cientistas sociais, mas infelizmente pouco assimilada por um vasto público, recusa falar de raça, que é o mesmo que naturalizá-la, e fala sim e incansavelmente sobre racismo, pois tal como observa Ta-Nehisi Coates no prefácio à coletânea das conferências de Morrison em Harvard, publicadas como The Origin of Others em 2017, e eu peço novo slide. Racist dehumanization is not merely symbolic. It delineates the borders of power. E é sempre presente, como expressou Ralph Ellison, é perirracismo na proposta de Anne Ducil. Ficou inscrito nas instituições e todas as estruturas da sociedade como qualquer fenómeno sistémico. Atualmente, a rejeição das políticas de ação afirmativa, o ressurgimento da segregação, a militarização da polícia, as políticas de racial profiling e de encarceramento são evidentes provas dessa persistência. Contra o racismo só resta resistir e lutar pela liberdade. Já Ralph Ellison dizia, eu cito, The society is not likely to become free of racism. Thus, it is necessary for Negroes to free themselves by becoming their idea of what a free people should be. O racismo, como tão eloquentemente nos mostra Morrison em A Mercy, o seu romance de 2008, estava lá antes da raça, pois brotou do desejo de excluir e suprimir a diferença. A Mercy, cuja história se localiza na Virgínia nos anos de 1680-90, desvela como nos primeiros tempos da colonização do território onde hoje temos os Estados Unidos, não se pode considerar que vigorava efetivamente o racismo. Como Morrison declarou numa entrevista quando o romance foi publicado, a história surgiu-lhe da curiosidade sobre um tempo em que a escravatura ainda não tinha sido associada à raça. Segundo ela, esta associação surgiu para proteger os ricos dos pobres. O mundo que é representado no romance é, como Morrison o apelida, um mundo desorganizado, com uma estrutura muito solta de relações de classe e de raça. Na propriedade do holandês Jacob Vark, trabalham com estatutos análogos Lina, uma indígena, Florence, uma africana, 2 europeus, Willard e Scully, e Sorrow, uma jovem mestiçada de origem mais ou menos desconhecida. Mas se formos a ver, a mulher inglesa ou que veio de Londres, Rebecca Vark, que é a senhora da casa, foi vendida ao marido pelo pai, que a meteu num navio rumo às Américas e assim se livrou de mais uma boca para alimentar. Durante as ausências de Jacob, os 6 elementos acabam por formar uma pequena comunidade, mais ou menos solidária, que, no entanto, revela a sua fragilidade quando a morte de Jacob e a conversão religiosa fundamentalista de Rebecca acabam por estilhaçá-la. O romance, cruzando a história com a ficção, alude à rebelião de Bacon. Bacon, que é o Nathaniel Bacon, um aristocrata inglês, que, na Virgínia, reuniu um exército improvável, formado por fazendeiros, servos contratados, os chamados indentured servants, quer brancos, quer negros, e até africanos escravizados e indígenas, juntando, portanto, vários estatutos, classes e raças contra o poder naquela altura constituído. No entanto, foi a partir daí que os fazendeiros perceberam, lá está, os que tinham propriedade, e aprendemos muito com a apresentação anterior, da Justine, perceberam que era mais rentável e segura a escravização de africanos e o trabalho forçado passou a ser consistentemente racializado. O racismo e também o sexismo foram sendo assim construídos pelo sistema colonialista e capitalista com a lógica da divisão de trabalho. E agora um novo slide. Numa entrevista a Lynn Neary, da Rádio Pública Nacional, em 2008, sobre este mesmo romance, em Mercy, Morrison afirma que o motivo que ele levou a focar-se naqueles primeiros tempos da colonização foi separar a raça da escravatura. E eu cito-a: to separate race from slavery, to see what it was like, what it might have been like to be a slave, but without being raised, where your status was being enslaved, but there was no application of racial inferiority. Como consequência da rebelião de Bacon, à qual Jacob, a personagem Jacob, chama People's War, sucedeu-se a legislação que racializou os africanos para, segundo ele, separar e proteger dali para a frente os brancos de todos os outros. Neste romance, Morrison enfatiza assim a construção, o aspecto de construção do conceito de raça como estratégia de poder. Contra esta lógica de poder e dominação, Morrison sempre tentou usar a sua escrita para limpar os códigos do racismo, que conspurcam o nosso olhar. Como diz numa entrevista feita por Charlie Rose, da PBS, em 93, "If I take your race away, and there you are, all strung out. All you got is your little self. And what is that? What are you without racism? Are you any good? Are you still strong? Are you still smart? Do you still like yourself? I mean, these are the questions." E é esta, no fundo, a proposta que ela nos faz, muitas vezes, quando tenta limpar de códigos. É olharmos para as pessoas. Para isso, exercitou a supressão de marcadores de raça, que contaminam a linguagem e nos conformam a visão do mundo e condicionam o nosso comportamento na sociedade. A primeira vez que Morrison o fez foi num conto publicado em 83, intitulado Recitative, com um primeiro e engenhoso exercício de nos desafiar na nossa percepção condicionada pelos códigos de identificação dominantes, apresentando as personagens sem marcadores de raça e complexificando a influência de estereótipos com a introdução de outras subalternidades, de género, de classe, de deficiência, através da personagem Maggie. Curiosamente, leituras críticas que o conto suscitou quase exigiam à autora que revelasse qual das 2 meninas que se encontraram no orfanato, Twyla ou Roberta, era negra e qual era branca, demonstrando que estamos tão presos aos códigos que temos dificuldade de ver para além deles, problematizando os efeitos da hierarquização que no fundo se traduz em inferiorização de alguns, que se instalou na sociedade americana. Morrison teve cuidado de não mencionar a cor da pele das personagens, como volta a fazer em Home, ou explorou outras formas de exclusão, como em Paradise, em que inverteu o sentido da discriminação, feita agora por afro-americanos, de outros afro-americanos, banidos da All Black Town, portanto, as cidadezinhas que se formaram só para negros depois das emendas à Constituição, depois da Guerra Civil, por não terem suficiente, portanto, eram banidos por não terem suficiente e autêntico, não serem suficiente e autenticamente negros, como os que os recebiam, os 8 Rock. Ou abordou os efeitos do colorismo, como em God Bless the Child. Mas, tal como acontece com a identidade racial, a definição da cor da pele é uma construção social, cultural, económica e política, como observa Boaventura de Sousa Santos. O colonialismo mobilizou a cor da pele como política identitária. Eu cito. E agora pedia novo slide à Beatriz. A cor da pele, exato. A cor da pele vai constituir um dos vetores fundamentais da linha abissal que distingue entre humanos e subhumanos, a distinção que subjaz ao racismo. A percepção da cor deixou de ser uma característica física da pele para se tornar um marcador de poder, uma construção cultural. No entanto, dramaticamente, a Racial House de que nos fala Morrison num ensaio de 1998, que ela intitulou Home, inserido na coletânea do Anima Lubiano The House That Race Built, é a única casa, e aqui obviamente nós às vezes temos alguma dificuldade em traduzir obviamente de língua para outra língua, home no sentido inglês, não é? Mas que é para nós casa, que os afro-americanos conhecem e que podem chamar sua. Portanto, a Racial House é no fundo a única home para eles, apesar de estarem condenados a não se sentirem em casa. Como exprimiu mais tarde Morrison num texto a que deu significativamente o título de Foreigner's Home, que está incluído em The Origin of Others, o problema subsiste. E agora eu pedia não está aqui ainda. Of not being at home in their homeland, of being exiled in the place where they belong. Um romance que me surge como um eloquente exemplo para basear toda esta estratégia de significação é Home. A Justine já vos falou hoje tanto de Home, mas eu vou lê-lo também à minha maneira. Frank Money, um jovem de 24 anos, recentemente regressado da Guerra da Coreia, profundamente afetado por ela, física e psicologicamente, foge do hospital psiquiátrico, ainda sob efeitos da morfina, mal sabendo onde está ou porque está ali. Uma nota anónima que lhe tinha chegado às mãos, avisando do perigo que corria a irmã, Si, dão-lhe forças para encetar uma atribulada viagem para ir em seu socorro. Ambos tinham deixado a pequena povoação de Lotus, na Geórgia, onde não havia futuro. Mas nenhum deles encontrou uma mudança positiva nas suas vidas. Nem Frank a encontrou na experiência militar, nem Si, que acabou a servir na casa de um médico eugenista que a usou como cobaia, deixando-a quase morta. É nesta condição de extrema vulnerabilidade que os irmãos se reúnem, despojados de agência, ameaçados de morte, sem proteção. A não ser aquela que Frank encontra na rede de solidariedade entre negros como ele, através de uma América segregada, e Si na outra empregada negra da casa do Dr. Bow, que enviou a mensagem a Frank, dando-lhe conta do que se passava com a irmã. A segunda parte da viagem é a dos dois, de regresso à terra natal, Lotus. Enquanto lá, Si é curada pelas mulheres mais velhas da aldeia, no romance We've Seen It All Eyes, Frank redescobre ali uma beleza e uma paz que antes não tinha conseguido apreciar. Lotus, afinal, é um lugar seguro, em contraste com o mundo que entretanto conhecera, cheio de violência e agressões. Tal como as outras personagens de Morrison, Frank e Si cresceram e aprenderam. Metáfora disso é a percepção diferente das figuras dos cavalos que surgem no início do romance e recorrem no final. a memória da infância de terem visto 2 cavalos garbosos, standing like men, em contraste com o pé de um negro, ainda palpitante, a sair de um buraco para onde o corpo anónimo tinha sido atirado, muito possivelmente por linchamento, depois de um linchamento. Essa imagem tinha impressionado profundamente os 2 irmãos ainda crianças. Para Frank, especialmente, essa memória pode tê-lo marcado como a negação da sua própria masculinidade. Mas no final, Frank pede a Si que traga a primeira coberta de trapos feita por ela e vão tentar encontrar o sítio onde tinham visto o tal pé palpitante, símbolo da desvalorização humilhante das vidas dos afro-americanos. Descoberto o sítio, Frank desenterra os ossos, embrulha-os cuidadosamente na coberta e ambos procuram um lugar certo para finalmente lhes dar um enterro digno. E é ao pé de um loureiro à beira do rio que escolhe enterrá-lo num buraco bem fundo para que o gentleman possa ficar de pé. No local, Frank prega uma tábua onde pintou "Here stands a man". Esta homenagem de respeito e dignidade que os 2 irmãos se esforçaram por fazer àquele homem anónimo é a medida do respeito e dignidade que agora exigem para si próprios. Como guardiã, fica ali a pequena árvore rachada, e agora um novo slide, por favor, ao meio, rachada ao meio, um braço para a direita, outro para a esquerda, sugerindo a cruz cristã. E numa citação que a Justine ainda acabou de mostrar, a luz do fim do dia acaba por criar uma auréola à volta também desta cruz, não é? Split down the middle, beheaded, undead, spreading its arms, one to the right, one to the left. É esta a descrição da árvorezinha. O olhar demorado de Frank devolve ao leitor como uma imagem última da beleza e empoderamento, apesar da agressão que a rachou ao meio, tal como a vida rachou estes 2 jovens por dentro. Mas eles querem e irão sobreviver, tal como o texto nos promete. It looked so strong, so beautiful, hurt right down at the middle, but alive and well. As últimas palavras do romance são de Si. Come on, brother, let's go home. Home, que dá o título ao romance, ressurge assim com os significados de lugar seguro, pertencimento, comunidade e entreajuda. Where race does not matter. Em contraste com a racial house, conotada com a segregação, a violência e um mais penalizador racismo. Embora íntima e discreta, a capacidade de agir, a agência de Frank e Si, associada à dignidade, ao sentido de comunidade, compõe a moldura de cidadania neste romance. Não a cidadania plena, que o sistema social tem negado aos afro-americanos ao longo da história, mas ainda assim, uma lição de cidadania como valor, em resposta ao depauperamento a que Morrison a vê tão sujeita num sistema capitalista neoliberal e racista. Por tudo isto, eu defendo que a causa maior na escrita de Toni Morrison é a defesa da cidadania. Na opinião da escritora, cabe à literatura tornar possível que experienciemos a esfera pública sem qualquer constrangimento ou submissão, implicando no uso desses termos a limitação de acesso, qualquer limitação de acesso, por imposição de qualquer autoridade. Por isso, a sua escrita foi sempre uma escrita preocupada com valores, com a transmissão de uma ideia de comunidade, valorização da causa pública, ou seja, a participação na construção de um mundo melhor. No texto que atrás mencionei, Literature and Public Life, ela própria dá Beloved, Jazz e Paradise como exemplos da forma como tentou contrariar esse empobrecimento das nossas vidas, fomentando o nosso espírito crítico, convocando-nos para reapreciarmos, debatermos, enfim, pensarmos sobre o social para o tentarmos transformar. Em Beloved, Morrison destaca o papel da personagem Beloved, que não assombra só a memória da sua mãe, mas se corporiza para chamar à responsabilidade toda uma comunidade. Em Jazz, o leitor é interpelado no final em relação à sua própria posição com o livro nas mãos, que diz: Say, make me, remake me, you are free to do it and I am free to let you, because look where your hands are now. E ali temos nós estamos a acabar o livro e estamos com ele na mão. o que expõe a participação da leitura em todo o processo de escrita e a sua corresponsabilidade. E agora um novo slide. Como Morrison expressa, the act of reading as having public consequences, even public responsibility. Em Paradise temos um final talvez inesperado, aparentemente desligado do tema principal, com a imagem do navio a aproximar-se do porto, onde está Consolata e Piedade. As duas brasileiras, lembram-se? Mas afinal retoma-se a ideia que presidiu à criação desta narrativa, a ideia de paraíso, não como lugar ideal, mas apenas como um produto imaginário humano, por isso sujeito ao fracasso, capaz de exclusão. E eu cito, "Now they will rest before shouldering the endless work they were created to do down here in paradise." Quanto a mim, o ato de responsabilização que nos convoca como leitores para a participação na vida pública como verdadeiros cidadãos e cidadãs está patente já em The Bluest Eye, seu primeiro romance. Morrison representa a vitimização de uma criança mulher, negra, pobre, o exemplo paradigmático de mais intensa vulnerabilidade de raça, sexo, classe e idade, como a autora comentou no pós-fácil à edição Penguin de 2007, do romance. E eu cito, "How something as grotesque as the demonization of an entire race could take root inside the most delicate member of society, a child, the most vulnerable member, a female." Mas com quem ficamos no final é com a voz consciência de Clória, a chamar-nos individualmente e à comunidade e a toda a sociedade à responsabilidade ou o nosso dever de empatia com Pécula, à nossa responsibility. Todavia, a estrutura do romance justapõe histórias narrativizadas, a de Dick and Jane, passando pelos Back Tears, Breed Love. Primeira, usada como uma espécie de epígrafe, foi retirada do livro de leitura usado nos anos 40, altura em que Pécula, Frida e Clória, as três personagens, eram crianças no Ohio. Esse texto, tal como é manipulado pela escritora até à inteligibilidade, lembram-se que esse passo é apresentado 3 vezes e nas 3 vezes vai-se apertando o espaço entre as palavras até não haver espaço, que nos impede, nos dificulta e depois nos impede a leitura. Portanto, essa a inteligibilidade pode representar tanto o sonho americano negado aos afro-americanos, como a história política da hegemonia de uma classe média branca, supostamente representativa da sociedade no seu todo, por isso será apresentada às crianças no seu livro de leitura, mas na realidade exclusiva de um grupo dominante. As histórias seguintes de famílias negras pobres, os McTeer ou Breed Love, vêm contestá-la na sua exclusividade. Essa representação ficcional vem lembrar-nos que a cidadania universal não funciona, pois esse grupo homogéneo varre para as margens outros grupos a quem é vedada a agência cidadania plena. E relembro ainda, quando em A Mercy, temos logo no início a voz narradora que nos pergunta a nós leitores, "Who is responsible?" E logo acrescenta, "Can you read?" É de uma ironia fina. Toni Morrison sabe efetivamente utilizar a escrita como uma oportunidade quase pedagógica de fomentar nos leitores e leitoras uma atitude crítica e interventiva, formadora de cidadania. Não foi ela que sempre pensou que os leitores como ativos participantes? Mas também como uma forma de confrontar-nos, por vezes até agressivamente, com a sua cumplicidade nos erros e nas injustiças sociais. Uma verdadeira responsabilização de todos nós no mundo que temos e fazemos todos os dias. Ler, discorre Morrison em Invisible Ink, deve ajudar-nos a pensar com profundidade. Dos leitores não só espera participação, como lhes exige que a ajudem a escrever. Para isso é que utiliza o que chama a tal tinta invisível, desestabilizando o texto, recusando respostas e clarificação imediata das linhas do enredo, desafiando-nos a olhar para o que está fora do texto, a confrontá-lo com os sentidos construídos no próprio texto. Já vimos essa ideia explanada no ensaio de 1988, Unspeakable Things Unspoken, embrião do seu longo ensaio de 92, Playing in the Dark. Nesse primeiro texto, Morrison exemplifica a sua intencionalidade com a análise dos inícios dos seus romances. Conseguimos perceber o labor cuidado, minucioso, o plano elaborado e inteligente que nos manipula e nos desafia. Os inícios dos seus romances, que de facto nos deixam por vezes confusas ou atarantadas, prosseguindo às apalpadelas para buscar sentidos que muitas vezes resistem aos leitores e leitoras impacientes e até fazem alguns e algumas desistir. mas o plano está lá, claro e evidente. Deliberadamente não nos dar ajuda a compelir-nos a uma leitura verdadeiramente ativa e criativa. E agora, novo slide. I wanted the compelling confusion of being there as they, the characters, are, suddenly, without comfort or succor from the author, with only imagination, intelligence, necessity available for the journey. Percebo na estratégia de escrita de Morrison algo que também encontro em Bell Hooks, que nos fala do lado íntimo da linguagem. E eu cito Hooks, normally saved for family and loved ones. Abrindo um espaço seu e para a comunidade negra, numa língua que lhe negou. Morrison, em Unspeakable Things Unspoken, fala desse lado de intimidade, que une a autora aos leitores, que ela expressa como to link arms with the reader. Mas sem esquecer que, tal como em Bell Hooks, uma decisão importante está na escolha entre a mentalidade colonizadora e o lugar dos oprimidos. Esta é a terminologia que Hooks usa nesse texto de 1990. Toni Morrison claramente escolhe o lado dos oprimidos e desse posicionamento constrói o seu projeto contra-hegemónico, que encontra expresso com eloquência em Playing in the Dark. E agora novo slide, por favor. I want to draw a map, so to speak, of a critical geography, to use that map to open as much space of discovery, intellectual adventure, close exploration as did the original charting of the New World, without the bandit for conquest. Ora, convidados e convidadas a esta viagem intelectual e emocional de descoberta ao longo dos textos de Toni Morrison, temos de ser leitores criativos, creative readers, tal como preconizava já o Ralph Emerson. Mas o que a travessão nessa frase faz, vem enfatizar, é que a escritora recusa qualquer mandato, especialmente o de conquista. A única soberania que reclama está no uso da palavra, como nos diz no tal ensaio que eu tenho vindo a falar, Home. Esse texto, produzido quando estava a escrever o Paradise, discorre sobre a possibilidade de uma sociedade em que a concepção de raça não tivesse importância ou relevo. No fundo, a tal sociedade ideal onde não existisse racismo. Essa seria a América prometida. E eu cito-a, a world in which race does not matter. I want to inhabit, walk around a sight clear racist detritus, a place where race both matters and is rendered impotent. Portanto, é uma raça, no fundo, a raça que não importa, mas que, no fundo, é importante só porque define a nossa diferença e nós abraçamos essa diferença. Contudo, os Estados Unidos da América são the racial house that can never be home, como ela diz. Para ela, o exercício da linguagem, que é a escrita de ficção, pode constituir-se como um espaço de soberania e autoridade, talvez o único possível para quem conhece a dupla opressão por ser mulher e negra. Em toda a obra de Morrison encontramos estratégias desconstrutivas de um discurso racista. O discurso naturalizado é transparente, como nos diz Gayatri Spivak, a partir de Derrida, e arroga-se o direito de ser totalizador, universal e branco. Na escrita de sujeitos que sempre se viram distorcidos nessa estrutura naturalizada e transparentes numa narrativa totalizadora que assim os fez ausentes da história, percebe-se a necessidade de intervir na sociedade e de a transformar e melhorar, resistindo à tendência unificadora dos códigos, impondo a sua presença e revertendo uma violência epistémica de séculos. Por isso, Morrison afirma ter querido libertar-se do white gaze, esse olhar branco, reconquistando um sentido de liberdade sem as restrições desse olhar. Por isso, é insurreto o seu discurso, reclamando na sua insurreição o mais genuíno sentido de cidadania plena. Obrigada, Toni Morrison. Muito obrigada a vós por me ouvirem.
Isabel, muitíssimo obrigada. Foi uma apresentação excepcional. I'll turn into English now so that perhaps we can bring Just back. No, everybody, not just me. Justine, Isabel, everybody back, please.
I think Isabel had some problem, so I'm just gonna contact her.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Wow, what a shame. I hope I think Beatriz may be talking to her. Well, let's wait a bit. There she is. Wow, I thought you were running away from the questions. Okay, no, thanks. They were two great presentations. I want to thank Justine again. I'm sorry, motorbikes everywhere. I want to thank Justine again for bringing some very new information about and relationships, connections between Morrison, Locke, and these Arabic philosophical ideas. And I want to thank Isabel for this, also for the kinds of connections. I'm much more familiar. I'm just a reader of Toni Morrison. I don't really study her. I don't do any research on her work. But I'm familiar with the novels, but much less with the essays and all her criticism. And I think this was also a very, very interesting contribution that you have brought, that you established between her fiction and her essays, and not only critical but also general essays. So thanks very much. And I think in your in both presentations, I think you have actually reinforced the extraordinary power of her work, and also its very painful nature. Right? It's very painful to read her novels. I think they are absolutely beautiful, extraordinary language, and but painful to read. From a formal perspective, I think she explores a number of very exciting possibilities. I'm just making a very general comment here. I'm not asking questions, because there are questions that some of the audience has formulated. So I'd rather privilege their questions. And thanks again for this very, very heartwarming discussion. I know. I think all the issues are so important, and we are experiencing such a difficult time at the moment all over the world because of the pandemic. And I think that all these ideas, responsibility, home, nation, difference. This is all so very contemporary in terms of what we are facing everywhere. So thanks very much for your contribution. So I will have to have a look at the YouTube reactions here, so that I can choose some of the questions or comments that have been made, so that you can perhaps now interact with the audience. Okay, so I'm going to translate if the questions have been made in Portuguese, but anyway, let's see if I can. There are everybody's. Let me just say that everybody's thanking you here. The people in the audience, they are thanking you. Thank you for the amazing talk. Again, thank you both for the amazing presentations. And now maybe lots of thanks here. So, and also comments about, let's say, Toni Morrison herself and her contribution and enunciations about racism and all that. So let's now concentrate on the questions. So a question from Alison Oliveira. He would like to ask both of you if you believe there may be right now as a writer who would be a kind of heir to Toni Morrison. You could consider to be a kind of heir to Toni Morrison and to her work.
No. That is a very, very problematic question for me, because I think, as Isabel has demonstrated in her talk, Morrison was much more than a novelist. She was, in my view, one of the foremost intellectuals in the United States who had the talent and the wisdom to incorporate her understanding of both the politics and the history into a novelistic form, and who is responding not only to her contemporary activity, but also took in question some of the major thinkers that we were reading at the time. I mean, she dealt with Foucault, she dealt with Bakhtin, she dealt with the feminists, she dealt, well, with John Locke. She continued to deal with philosophers who are on her level. Now, do I see anybody else doing that? I don't know. I am not well read enough to think about that right now. Do you, Isabel?
I think it's very, very difficult. It's very difficult. It's too high for anyone, at least by now, for me to be able to find anyone that reaches that level. Portanto, é muito difícil, vou dizer as duas línguas para ver se a gente consegue dialogar. É muito difícil, de facto, responder essa pergunta, porque realmente Toni Morrison tem uma, como é que eu ia dizer, uma estatura, como dizia a professora Telly, é uma estatura não só de romancista, quer dizer, toda a sua intervenção intelectual, como eu dizia na minha apresentação, quase de um intelectual pública, ou seja, uma mulher que está sempre a intervir, a olhar, a criticar politicamente tudo o que vai acontecendo, e é extraordinário como nós agora encontramos textos, vamos reler, talvez por causa destas antologias que surgiram, 17 e 19, das suas intervenções, que ela fazia imensas em universidades, ela publicava em jornais, em revistas, entrevistas, etc. E percebemos como são atuais, coisas que ela dizia em 1990 e estão atualíssimas. Agora, é evidente, é difícil chegar, portanto, a essa multifacetada e completa intervenção de Morrison. Mas há já agora, só por, enfim, uma sugestão que eu faria, para quem não conhece, por exemplo, há uma escritora que eu tenho vindo a descobrir, que é haitiana americana, ou seja, é emigrada nos Estados Unidos, mas de origem haitiana, que é Edwidge Danticat. Tenho uma admiração enorme pela Morrison, e de facto, eu só digamos, consigo minimamente comparar no sentido em que há uma sensibilidade a esta intervenção intelectual, mas emocional ao mesmo tempo, que eu acho incrível, não é? Em Morrison, que eu encontro também em Danticat, e que tem, e também, no fundo, o cruzamento da escritora de ficção com o ativismo, e, portanto, com uma intervenção social. Justine, I was just mentioning, not to compare, because it's incomparable, but a writer from Haiti, but migrated to the United States, and is writing in English, Edwidge Danticat, and she is a great admirer of Toni Morrison. They were together in a certain forum for a discussion, debate, and she is also what I was mentioning. She is able to combine the intellectual and the emotional, as Morrison does. So she addresses us on both levels and integrating those two aspects, which makes it more engaging. And she's also an activist, and so she's very political in the way she combines the fiction with the observation of the surrounding world and all the issues that warrior us. Okay, that's all.
Thanks.
Okay.
Sorry.
Sorry. Add that Morrison was one of the most well-read. Not only was she brilliant, she was well-read. She read everything, and she engaged with everything she thought was worthy of her engagement. Yeah. I enjoyed Edwidge Danticat. I don't put her on that level. I would rather look at somebody like Jessica Ward, who's just beginning, but has really, really beautiful work. from the South. But anyway,
Yeah.
heir
Not to
apparent,
compare.
I don't see one.
Not to compare.
Okay, well, thank you. Well, and you've also given a suggestion on, another, even if incomparable, it's always, something or somebody's or some work we should be paying attention to. Anyway, so another question here. Let me see. Julia Braga Neves. See. My question, she asked her question in English, so I'm just going to read it. My question regards the notion of history and historiography in Morrison's work. Did Morrison pursue archival research for the writing of Home, as she did with Beloved? Follow-up question. Would you be able to comment on Morrison's approximation between historiography and fiction and its relation with postmodernism? It's a big question.
Let me say one thing before we begin. Morrison never talked about what she was doing. She never would give you a clue as to what you wanted to interpret. If you thought you had a clue from Morrison, she was probably throwing you off. Morrison wanted people to read her work and discover for themselves. She had the idea of Mikhail Bakhtin. Now, once the work of art is out in the world, then it takes on its own meaning. And we will read it differently in Brazil, differently in Portugal, differently in my little island on Tenerife. We will read them differently according to our backgrounds, according to our knowledge. Now, does she do archival work? I'm sure she does.
She does.
She doesn't invent anything but her stories, and she incorporates it. But yes, she worked extremely hard. It's just that she was extremely well read, and she was extremely adept at including what she had read into her writing. But as far as historiography, no, she's not writing historiography. She's not trying to. She's writing, let me go. The example of Beloved, which everyone has read, when she said she never wanted to write about slavery. Slavery was too vast, too wide, too complicated. But when she was reading Robert Byrd in Virginia, who said, put the bit on Jenny, she goes, what's the bit? And that led her to more and more investigation. Did she research? Of course, but she's not writing history because she wanted to write something that was very narrow and very deep. She wanted to find out what the institution would have done to the individual psyche. She's very much concerned with people, whether they're Black or not, people as people, and how they managed to survive. And she's also extremely respectful of the people who managed to survive, and I think pays them their due, gives them credit when she writes these novels. That's a long-term roundabout answer. Did she research? Yes, of course. And one of the books that she enjoyed was while she was an editor. She was not listed as the editor, but she edited at Random House, was the Black Book. And in the Black Book, there are so many stories that she took from. Just one little spark, and she was offering to run with it. I don't think that she writes historical novels, certainly not historiography, if you will. I think she writes stories, and those stories relate to the history of people surviving in the United States, or what became the United States. What did it mean?
Sandra, responde em português ou em inglês? Whatever.
Como quiser, pode fazer como fez antes.
I will try. I will try.
Pode responder em português e depois você faz um resuminho para Justine, se ela perdeu alguma coisa.
Exato. Eu estava realmente para também referir-me a esse livro, o Black Book, porque foi onde ela também, com o material, não é? Que é imenso material e é espetacular. Quem tiver a oportunidade de o adquirir, porque agora foi reeditado, The Black Book. E aí ela, por exemplo, ficou em contacto com a história da Margaret Garner, não é? Que depois a inspirou, digamos, para escrever o Beloved. Há uma entrevista dela, por exemplo, em Cornell, quando ela volta a Cornell, que ela frequentou, e com uma colega da Universidade de Princeton, e estão em diálogo, e ela refere, a colega diz, porque ela era colega dela em Princeton, e dizia, quando ela viu a montanha de livros que ela tinha reunido, porque estava a investigar para escrever a Mercy, por exemplo. I was also mentioning the Black Book and the contact with the slip of the newspaper of the time that gave her the story of Margaret Garner, but also an interview with I cannot remember the name of her colleague in Princeton when they were invited to Cornell, and there she is interviewing Morrison and mentioning the bunch of books that she had gathered to research for a Mercy, for writing a Mercy. So of course she was very rigorous in that, and she learned from history, but she also has that critical reviewing of historical facts that enable her to write a fiction.
And it is so beyond. I mean, it's not just the history of the United States. I mean, she has read about the African history, about Egyptian history, about the mythology. And what I found that was very interesting about A Mercy, since you bring it up, is that nobody seemed to have mentioned the fact that Florence comes from a Portuguese colony in Angola. And what was interesting, because some people were thrown off, the fact that she was wearing wooden shoes, and that the Angolans were actually wearing wooden shoes. Now,
but Booker T. Washington mentions in his autobiography that up from slavery, right? That he as a slave, as a little child, wore wooden shoes.
Yes.
So we have that, of course. Many enslaved people came from the region of Angola because they were good at tilling the land. Yeah. So that was fascinating in your talk, Justine. This transcultural journeys, right? The way knowledge and thinking, it's incredible. It was incredible. Yeah. Não consigo ouvi-la. Não ouço. Não.
I'm using two screens because I'm looking at you from StreamYard, and I'm also checking on YouTube to see what questions are. Right. So I'm sorry, I forgot to unmute my microphone. Once I'm just looking for another question here. See, yeah. Let's see. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yes? Okay. So one final question. It's a question for both of you. The question is, how far do you think the Morrison's provocation, what is race, allows us to stress, or let's say reinforce, Black experience rather than erasing it and aligning this experience with the narrative of all lives matter? I don't know if the question is clear because I'm translating it. So this idea that what race is a kind of provocation on Morrison's part. So how far does it allow us to, or allow her to stress, to reinforce, to bring forth Black experience rather than erasing it? And how far does that allow this particular provocation to align it with the narrative of all lives matter? This is a question by Vitória Ramos.
Eu responderia à Vitória que eu acho que aqui não há uma provocação, nem nunca haveria um alinhamento com a narrativa do All Lives Matter, que nós sabemos que, no fundo, vem distorcer o sentido do Black Lives Matter e do que é que fez surgir o Black Lives Matter. Eu acho que o que ela está a querer dizer é que race does not matter, ou seja, a raça não importa enquanto raça. O que importa nós falarmos, debatermos e tentarmos destruir é o racismo. Porque raça, como ela diz, a raça não é raça humana. Quando se fala de raça, e está-se sempre a falar de raça, e nós próprios no nosso discurso estamos a falar de raça, como categorias sociais vão sendo falando de raça, estão a dar predominância e presença e importância a algo que não devia ter importância enquanto usado para inferiorizar, para retirar direitos, não é? O que no fundo importa, e é isso que ela está a querer fazer, tanto no romance como nas suas intervenções, é dizer: a raça não interessa, não importa. Fizeram não importar usaram para excluir. Portanto, no usar para excluir, temos uma política de racismo. E é isso que nós temos que debater, não a raça. Não sei se fui clara.
Claríssima, Isabel. Claríssima. No fundo, if you allow me a comment, but in the end, even if there are these differences, perhaps the idea is the same. All lives matter, right? That's the. I don't know. I don't know what the movement implies. I'm not very familiar with the movement. They have a lot of. Okay, go on. You speak. You speak. Okay, I'm silencing myself. Justine,
can you hear me? Yeah. Okay, two things. Number one, Morrison has said that race is information, but it's empty information. That is, I can see that you are Black. I can see that you have freckles. I can see that you're blonde. But what does that really tell me about you? She takes all of this, of course, from Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, one of the, I think it was voted the greatest novel of the former 50 years in the United States. Ralph Ellison's protagonist, who has no name, is invisible, not because nobody can see him, but because they can only see his Blackness. They cannot see who he is. And of course, she plays on that very clearly in Piccola's incident with the shopkeeper when he cannot see anything but her Blackness. So Morrison has said that it's real information, but it's empty information. I have a problem now because you're getting into politics, Sandra, with all of this, that all lives matter.
No, I'm not going. It's Vitória who asked the question about that.
I'm just telling you, you have to be careful because on the surface structure, of course, all lives matter. And Morrison would say that all lives matter. But that all lives matter was simply to take away from the visibility of the problems of Black people in the United States. It's like saying blue lives matter. Yeah, well, they do. The policemen matter. Okay, but it started with Black Lives Matter because you are indiscriminately killing people because of the color of their skin. So don't go down and try to avoid the nature of the question, which is a racist question, right? By saying that, oh, everybody's important. Well, if everybody's so important, why did we get to this point? So, anyway, sorry, I'm a bit vociferous, but
no, but I think no, you don't have to apologize. No way.
Não, mas
We want
acho
to
que
hear you.
Sandra, mas se não se importa, eu só gostava de acrescentar em português para os que não estão à vontade em inglês, de acentuar aquilo que a professora Tali disse agora. É que, no fundo, a questão é, quando surge All Lives Matter, é para exatamente, de certa forma, neutralizar aquilo que era uma afirmação política, Black Lives Matter, e de facto é como diz a professora Tali, porque é que nós chegamos aqui a um momento, no meado do século XXI, em que ainda precisamos dizer que certas vidas importam. É porque elas realmente não têm importado, não é? Portanto, é um slogan político. O outro também é, não é? Mas vem esvaziar aquele e vem neutralizar e, no fundo, apagar a nossa visão, que deve ser política, de que realmente nem todas as vidas são iguais. Embora nós, não é, achássemos, pois somos todos iguais. Pois não, mas não somos. Nem todas as vidas são iguais.
Well, I think...
I don't know if you could follow me, Justine.
Sorry?
But I was trying to translate your idea for the ones who are not at ease with English. So I think because it is important, right? It is important to underline that all lives matter is a neutralization of the political principle of Black Lives Matter. As he's saying, all lives should be equal, but they are not. They are not. That's the problem.
Well, I think I'm sorry, but I don't think we have any more time here. Anyway, everybody is thanking you for these very, very illuminating talks, presentations. It's been a privilege to be able to get to know you, to hear you, and we are very, very glad that you could accept our invitation. So we still have, I'm sorry I'm not going to be able to be with you this afternoon because I have a class. I teach all afternoon. And I do hope you have a very, very nice time with the rest of the discussion, which I will only be able to perhaps have some idea of afterwards when I watch the videos on YouTube, because they are all being recorded, so I'll have the opportunity to do that. So I already apologize for my absence this afternoon, but I have a very good justification. I have to teach from 2:30 to 6. So I'll be yes, it's a long afternoon. So it's a graduate course, and then I'll be busy all afternoon. But thanks very, very much for your presentations, and I hope to see you again tomorrow or the day after tomorrow. Perhaps if you have the time to go on and stay with us for the next 2 days. And I queria também agradecer todos aqueles que nos acompanharam até agora e convidá-los para que continuem participando essa tarde, nas mesas da tarde, e nos próximos 2 dias. Muito obrigada a todos. Nós vamos, então, agora encerrar essa atividade.
Obrigada de novo, muito obrigada pelo convite, foi um prazer estar aqui. And I'm looking forward to your new book. It was a wonderful presentation, Justine. Looking forward.
Lovely. Wait a minute. Lovely to see you again. Thank you for the invitation, and good luck to everyone. I hope that what comes out of this is more love for the work of Toni Morrison. Thank you.
Most certainly. I'm sure about that. Thank you. Bye, everybody. Até logo. Boa tarde para todos.